Waheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar hosted by the Sikh Research Institute. My name is Gurleen Kaur and the presentation will start soon. Before we get started, I wanted a few important things to make this webinar go smooth. I will then provide some information about Sikh Research Institute and today's presenters, Jasleen Kaur and Gurleen Kaur. You're looking at an example of the GoToWebinar attendee interface. It is made up of two parts, the viewer window on the left, which allows you to see everything the presenter will share on the screen, and the control panel at the right. The audio panel provides audio information. By default, you have joined the webinar via mic and speakers. If you prefer, you can join the audio via telephone by selecting Use Telephone, and the dial-in information will be displayed, including an audio pin. You can also send your questions either by typing it in your question panels, or you may ask it over the mic. You can send the question to us while the session is in progress. I will now provide some background on the Institute and also the presenters. SikhRI connects people with the teaching of SikhRI and strengthens the bond of Sikh community around the world by offering courses and seminars in a variety of mediums. At SikhRI, we hold events on many topics throughout North America. Whether you are recently married, managing a Gurdwara, or just interested in diving deeper, we have a workshop for you. You can find out more about our upcoming events and products and any other information you're looking for at SikhRI.org. I'm now going to introduce you to the presenters. Jasleen Kaur. She is a double UVA grad in religious studies, focusing on South Asian religions and the conception of religious identity through the lens of literature and poetry. She is currently working as a researcher with SikhRI and took part in the design and delivery of Naujawan Soji, a course for Sikh teenagers. Gurleen Kaur. She is a 2017 Sidak Alum. She first became heavily engaged in conversation on gender disparities during her time at UC Berkeley, where she and her college friends became co-founders of an initiative called Kaur Voices, an event dedicated to giving space to the voices of Punjabi women through art, poetry, and performance. Gurleen has been a community educator on topics such as healthy masculinities and relations for organizations including the Jakara Movement, the Sikh Family Center, SAANJH, and SAANJH. She recently graduated with her Master of Education from the Harvard Graduate School of Education with a focus on gender violence prevention. Gurleen is currently an education and prevention specialist with the Violence Prevention and Response Team at MIT. Now, without any delay, I'm going to pass it over to Jasleen Kaur and Gurleen Kaur to begin today's presentation.
Waheguru Ji Ka
Khalsa, Waheguru Ji Ki Fateh.
Thank you all for being here. We're very excited. We're going to get started. So I'm just going to go through a little overview of the topic and give you some background for those of you who don't know much about the background of the Me Too movement. So let me start with background. So in 2006, Tarana Burke founded the Me Too movement to help survivors of sexual violence, particularly young women of color from low-income communities, find the language to speak about their experiences, build systems of support, and propel conversations to help them heal. The Me Too movement is an individual and collective declaration that women and men share experiences and struggles around inequality, harassment, and violence, and it redirects the already existing narrative that we often hear of victim blaming and takes a position that shame should be held by those who have abused and not by the ones who have been abused. It's not limited to workplace harassment or sexual violence. The goal of the movement, as stated on their website, is to uplift radical community healing as a social justice issue and to commit to disrupting all systems that allow sexual violence to flourish. So I'm sure, as many of you know, last year around the same time, October 2017, we saw Me Too grow into an international movement after going viral on social media as a hashtag used to break the silence that empowers perpetrators and to illustrate how prevalent sexual assault is, how prevalent harassment and gender-based violence are around the world. So the growth of the movement and its push into the mainstream has given survivors around the world a space to share their stories and ears to hear their stories. But as the momentum of the movement is continuing to grow, we see that one of the criticisms is that the voices of minority communities, voices that are usually on the margins, haven't really been able to have the same momentum. And we're building, like we're going to talk a little bit about the movement in India, but we're interested in the question of what our community's Me Too moment will look like, and what we can do as a community to create comfortable and safe spaces for survivors to share their stories and heal. So what can we do to build that momentum to hopefully have something like it, and doesn't even need to be like it? So those are the questions that we're going to ask. The overview is just, we're going to start with disclaimers because it is a sensitive issue, and so we have plenty of disclaimers for you. And then we're going to look at community context and then take you through the unique challenges we have as a community dealing with this particular issue and the unique resources that we have. And then we'll do conclusions and questions and discussion after that. So thank you again for joining us. Let's get started.
So the disclaimers, while Jasleen and I have done a lot of thinking about this topic, neither of us claim to be experts in the field. Because this is a topic grounded in lived experience, we believe everyone has something to contribute with this topic. What we're presenting is not a concretized science, but rather a thesis we're hoping to explore in greater detail with you all today. So just about the context, although we are approaching this subject with the entirety of the month in mind, we're briefly going to talk about India and China, some of the international Me Too movements. We're largely focusing on the Western diasporic context. And then language, I'm going to speak a little bit about this. So there's a lot of terms out there, and in this presentation, we're going to try to do our best to focus and use just two terms, sexual assault and gender-based violence. But I'm going to try to give us a little bit more context about gender-based violence in general. So, you know, some people will say like, you know, like, unless it's rape, it like doesn't really count. But really, there's a lot of things from, as you can see in this diagram, from least intense to most intense that contribute to an entire system of oppression. So some of the terms you might have heard thrown out there are stalking, sexual harassment, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, dating violence, domestic violence. There's a lot out there. They kind of fall on this spectrum right here. And on the next slide, we can see how it's all part of the same system. So you have, you know, people saying like boys will be boys, or in our community, we have different ways of saying that, or we have rape jokes. And all of that contributes to the normalization of violence that allows rape or domestic violence or intimate partner violence to be okay and to be silenced. It's important that we don't minimize anyone's experience. So something might make someone uncomfortable and be completely inappropriate, and that is okay. Like, that's not okay, but we should validate that, as opposed to saying like, unless it's the worst of the worst, it doesn't count. It all counts. It's all sucky. It's all really bad. And it's all part of the same system. And so in order to tackle that system, we have to start at the bottom and move up. So the last disclaimer we have here is a warning that, you know, whether or not you've experienced any of these forms of violence, you might be affected by this presentation or this conversation in some way. just by hearing about it, there's this thing called vicarious trauma that happens, that we kind of can internalize the pain that other people are experiencing. So just a warning that, like, hey, this presentation might affect you in ways that you might not know. So you know, feel free to log off, but also, like, consider doing something lighthearted, taking a walk, you know, listening to music, doing blocked, whatever else that floats your boat after this presentation. Just some resources as well. So for those of you who are not familiar, the Sikh Family Center is a United States-based organization. They have a national helpline that anyone can call into. I encourage everyone here, if they haven't already, to put this number and put this email into their phones. You'll never know when you have someone in our community you might need to support, and it's good to have that resource on hand. We do everything from supporting folks through legal issues and housing issues, safety issues around dating and domestic violence, but also things like if you're a kid and you need help with your SAT test, like, we can help connect you to a resource. So we're here for all of that. You can call in and we'll respond to you within 48 hours. Some people don't feel as comfortable, and this totally makes sense, to contact a Sikh resource because of how how close-knit our community is. So if you feel that way, there's other resources out there that I've worked with, the National Sexual Assault Hotline and National Domestic Violence Hotline. They're great. They have an escape button in case you need to escape the websites suddenly for safety reasons. They also have a chat box you can chat into, whatever works for you. And our final disclaimer, it's important to recognize that domestic violence and sexual assault are not unique problems that only occur in Sikh communities. All communities face bias, all communities face violence. But that being said, the means for addressing any universal issue must be contextual. So we have to address the power imbalances that are specific to Sikh contexts. We have to address the gender discrepancies specific to Sikh contexts, the way that Sikh and Punjabi culture sanction violence and silence the voices of those who've experienced harm. So this is a question we want you all to think about kind of to yourselves, and then we have some thoughts on it as well. So what are some common responses from the Sikh community when someone comes forward having experienced sexual assault or domestic violence? We were going to come up with a list, but then after posting about the workshop or the webinar online, we actually got a lot of feedback back from people that kind of gives us some insight into the psyche of our community. So these are things that I'm sure many of us have heard when someone says they've experienced any sort of gender-based harm. This is just starting with the number one. This is just something that's a game for entertainment for rich people, or it only happens in poor families. It's an issue of the poor. Neither of those are true. Gender-based violence affects people across socioeconomic status. It's not a rich issue. It's not a poor issue. It has to do with power. I've heard this a lot, number two, especially from people I love the most, that someone in our community will come forward having been assaulted or experienced some sort of violence against someone in power, and the response, the immediate knee-jerk reaction will be to say, like, they're trying to harm our community or dishonor our name, they're trying to dishonor our favorite baisab, whatever it is. That's the knee-jerk reaction, not to listen and to believe the person coming forward. Or I've heard this a lot as well. These people are just bored, they're making up things. Or number four, to completely reject the idea at all, which is fascinating, and we'll hear a little bit more about. And if the survivor is acknowledged at all, they're kind of dishonored, or like their name is tarnished, and they're considered weak. So they're not strong enough to deal with whatever they're dealing with, and they're weak, and now they're making our community look weak. And of course, my favorite one of all, anything in our community is used as an excuse and opportunity to attack the Muslim community, which is never okay. So Posts like this send the message to survivors that not only will you not be believed if you speak up, you will be mocked. And just in real life, where silence validates the harm, not speaking up makes these things okay and sends the message to survivors that, okay, this is how other people feel. I guess I'm never going to speak up. And you can see this, the silence is there as well. People silently liked some of these posts, and there's up to like 37 likes on some of these really, really harmful posts, which is terrifying. So not only does this exist, thinking back to that pyramid, so these posts are kind of that bottom of the pyramid, that language that feeds into behavior. But we also have very recent, very terrible examples of behavior in our community that has been silencing victims. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the story of Gurbuxsh Chawla incident. So Gurbuxsh Chawla is I think like a tech individual in the Bay Area, very, very wealthy, who was, he was found guilty for domestic violence and for assaulting his ex-girlfriend. So there was like a court case, there's a lot going on. There was even video coverage of the assault. And San Jose Gurdwara decided to openly support him without ever thinking about the survivor, without ever thinking about the ex-girlfriend, the person who was being harmed. The immediate knee-jerk reaction again was, she doesn't matter, that person doesn't matter, we have to support the person whose name is being tarnished. It became all about Gurbuxsh and supporting him, which is not okay. So all of this put together, thinking about that pyramid, thinking about these posts and the things that our community has done, sometimes the fight against gender-based violence can kind of feel like a huge weight, like this impossible weight, lots of things stacked up against us that we have to fight it, and an impossible fight in many ways. And international examples kind of add to that. So both of these articles I'm going to share have just been released in the last month. So the Me Too movement has just, I think, re-blown up again in India. But again, the reaction is not like, oh, let's hear more, let's empathize. The reaction is, from Indian men in particular, is them saying that they are the ones under attack. And I've heard also that they've created their own hashtag called Blame Me Too. And in China, it goes even further. The government has like tracked the hashtags and blocked them, censored them out. So Me Too and hashtag Me Too and hashtag Me Too in China, women are speaking up, people who have been harmed have been speaking up, but there's censorship. So it's a lot. There's a lot of different forces, a lot of power that is in place to silence people who are coming forward.
So we're going to talk about what makes the Me Too movement in the Sikh community unique. And this is just an overview of the 4 things we sort of parsed out when we were thinking about this question. So we have a very close-knit community, as we know. There's ideas of taboo and shame attached to that experience. We have legacies of Punjabi masculinity, and we have the final protecting the Sikh brand. So all of that is what we're going to delve into now. But before we do, we know that it's a little bleak to say, and all of this has probably been pretty overwhelming so far, but we know it's pretty bleak to say, like, these are unique challenges, and there's so many of them. There's 4 huge challenges, but there's also a lot to draw from Gurbani and from Tawariq, from our history. And so we want to make sure that we're not leaving here feeling like this is hopeless. I think what we'll find as we go through these problems is that our history and our Gurbani tell us or give us at least some sort of direction on how to deal with those unique challenges. Okay, so as we all know, Sikh communities, especially in the diaspora, tend to be very close-knit and very insular. And we do that for survival, we do that for comfort of cultural familiarity, but there are also drawbacks that come with being so tight-knit. We know about gossip, we know about judgment, we know about issues where one person's actions or experiences tend to reflect on the reputation of their entire family. And so a barrier standing in the way of survivors that may cause hesitation in claiming the hashtag is that oftentimes abusers are within the family, they're close to the family, or they're part of the same community as the survivors. And a lot of times, as was sort of alluded to before, those perpetrators can include religious authorities who have the respect of the entire community behind them. So there are questions of how people will respond if the survivor speaks out, whether they'll be blamed, whether they will even be believed at all. So before speaking out and involving themselves in Me Too, those who have suffered from gender violence have to weigh the outcomes and consider the possibility of being shamed or being cast out by their loved ones and by the community members they're closest to. But good news, the Guru Granth Sahib gives us a little bit of direction, a lot of direction here. So we know Guru Granth Sahib begins with Ek Onkar. Everything is one, the one all-pervading force flowing through all of creation, and the recognition of the divine light that exists in all beings. So, I mean, I think it's fair to say if all of creation is equally divine, equally cherished by and cared for by the Creator, and that's something that we know, that we see in our Gurbani, then we too, as a part of creation, must do our best to see Ek Onkar and all, and not just see it, to act on it and to take care of other people. So this is a foundational principle that translates into acting as allies for other marginalized communities, fighting for those who are not being treated equally or with compassion, either by individuals or by entire systems of oppression. And so taking care of each other means supporting survivors and helping them speak up or speaking up on their behalf if they don't feel comfortable speaking up in their situations. So yeah, and I also wanted to mention there's this, the Saki we all know of Guru Hari Ji and the rose, and when his robes brushed the rose and the petals fell onto the ground while he was walking in the garden, he cried at the harm he had caused. So that's a great example of how to be compassionate and empathetic. I mean, if he can do it for a rose, we should be able to do it for our fellow human beings. But yeah, okay. So the next one, taboo and shame. Because of socially constructed taboo, we have not created spaces to have much needed dialogues about sexual violence, harassment, consent, Punjabi masculinity, which we'll get into, male entitlement, and enabling. We haven't worked as a community, and we've talked about this. It's not fair to say that nobody has worked on it, because there are small spaces, usually led by women, where this sort of thing is happening, but we have to do more. So we have to create more space to help people begin to feel comfortable enough to speak about their experiences. But the problem is that there's even a taboo of discussing like sexuality and what a healthy relationship looks like. That's something that we just avoid because it's difficult for us to talk about. So if we can't even do that, like how are we going to delve into the experiences of survivors? So all of that taboo means that survivors are vulnerable to being manipulated by their abusers into silence. There's a lot of shame attached to even speaking about things that have happened. And because it's taboo, it's hard to even know when something that has happened to us is unacceptable because we've had very little conversation or no conversation about what a healthy sexual interaction looks like, about what a healthy relationship looks like. And it means that we have nothing to compare our experiences to. Okay.
So I really like this line from Japji Sahib, Suniye maniye man ki tabao. Our hukam from the Guru is to listen, to accept, and keep love in our hearts and mind, especially when it comes to following the Guru's orders. This is a practice we believe naturally extends into daily life and in the context of gender-based violence. It's easy to listen and to feel love when we agree with something. The challenge comes when we disagree with people. So when it comes to gender-based violence, our immediate, like I said before, knee-jerk reaction might be to question or, to have doubts. But remembering this line, it's important to listen and to accept and to love in the fight for a violence-free community.
Okay, so legacies of Punjabi masculinity. I know this one is like these are a lot of buzzwords, but there's an added issue of a lack of distinction between, and we talked about this all the time, between religious ideals and cultural ideals. So we always talk about the tension between Punjabi and Sikh sort of morals or ideals, and they butt heads a lot. So for us, a lot of times those two things kind of become inseparable. And that means that masculinity is seen as something that is very rooted in like the Punjabi ideals that we have, or the Punjabi ideals of masculinity that we have, instead of the Sikh ideals of masculinity. And then on top of that, something that's sort of seen as inherent in the Sikh identity is masculinity, is being macho, is being manly. I'm trying to think of all the other ways to say it, but think of the various times, and maybe you haven't seen this, but on social media, where men within the community who don't fit into that ideal of masculinity are viewed as a threat to the Sikh image, or they're viewed as like anti-Sikh, because anything that is construed as feminine, or anything that's construed as like not fitting that ideal of Punjabi masculinity is seen as a way of sort of like turning over, subverting, turning upside down the history of our people, which is really dangerous.
I recently had the opportunity to sit down with a group of Punjabi boys and talk to them a little bit about masculinity, and the phrase that came up in that dialogue was banda ban, and it was interesting because banda ban, or like become a man, that's something we say to our boys in a many different ways, about whether it's, you know, being more powerful or being less emotional. It's something that we do uniquely to men. It's never like become a woman. That's not something we say. But if you don't follow certain social norms, everything about you as a person, as a man, can be questioned. So masculinity, both in the Punjabi and Western context, is appraised based in large part on the unfair treatment of women. So being largely involved with multiple women at once, getting them to do things for you that undermine their agency, and at the end of the day, gaining clout amongst your friends while that person's reputation suffers. Men and boys feel entitled to women's bodies, and they're enabled by other men and boys and by other women and girls in our community, who protect them while shaming their victims. So Punjabi masculinity, the masculinity that exists today, is very antithetical to the humble and compassion-centered masculinity that the gurus tried to inspire within us. That Jasleen's going to talk more about.
So we all know Babar Bani, I'm sure. So that sort of like macho posturing that we talked about, where women and girls, or more generally those deemed to be vulnerable regardless of gender, are used as instruments in the power games of boys and men, is not new. So this is not like a new thing that's come up in 2017, 2018. It's a pattern that's existed for a long, long time. So we see Guru Nanak Sahib address this very issue in Babar Bani. Ruler at the time of this composition was the Sultan of Delhi, a Pathan named Ibrahim Lodi. And Babur, the Mughal emperor, came in to invade from Central Asia, and a confrontation between those two power centers, the conquerors and the indigenous, led to an immense battle for power. So Guru Nanak Sahib describes his own eyewitness accounts and documentations of the atrocities of Babur and his men, and the plight of women as tools of subjugation through violence and systemic violation. So he basically, I mean, the sort of short way to say that is that he is describing in detail, yes, through metaphor, but in detail, what is being done to women, as sort of the, I mean, people will say collateral damage, but that's not even giving justice to the suffering of these women. But they're being treated this way as collateral damage in the power games of these two power centers. So it's important to note that Guru Nanak Sahib does not draw like large conclusion about the nature of the divine or the problem of evil from his descriptions, or make some sort of like existential excuse for the actions of these men. He's not trying to dismiss it or explain it away, but instead he's painting a very vivid picture of the horrific acts he's witnessing for the purpose of documentation and for the purpose of calling these power centers out. So even the act of documentation is revolutionary. The act of calling out oppressors and perpetrators of such harm is itself revolutionary. So Guru Sahib uses his place of privilege as a man and as a respected member of the community to speak up for those who are suffering. So I don't know, can we honestly say we're living up to this example in our current context? Something to think about. Okay, last one, protecting the Sikh brand. So survivors often find themselves stuck between wanting to call out abusers within the community and feeling like they have to stay silent to keep up this image that we have of the community as a whole, especially in the current political and social climate. So the South Asian diasporic community, and the Sikh community especially, is classified as the model minority group, right? So we're very comfortable in that classification. We even drum it up. We focus our time and energy and money on public relations and building our brand, framing ourselves as model citizens who can be counted on to do no wrong. So there's like no concept that there's a such thing as like a bad person who also happens to be a Sikh. So we're always good, and we're always willing to fight against oppression and for those who are being treated unfairly or unjustly. But that means that we are protective and careful about what sort of information we let out about members of our insulated communities, and we see anything that doesn't fit our already existing narrative as a threat to the brand. So we silence and ignore victims. It certainly doesn't help that the stereotypes often associated with brown people are those of extreme misogyny, abuse, patriarchal communities, and like huge inequality between men and women. There's a fear that exists in the Panth, and understandably in many other minority communities as well, of making the community look bad or painting members of the community in a bad light, especially in a way that will sort of reinforce already existing stereotypes that other people outside of the community have about us. So we don't have the luxury of like differentiation or nuance when it comes to like the majority's gaze, the majority's opinion and classification of Sikhs. For minority communities, as we all know, the parts are always substituted for the whole. But the burden of protecting the community from generalizations sort of put onto us by the majority, it always falls on the victims. And it's not the responsibility of women or men in our community to safeguard people who have caused them harm just for the purpose of keeping the community's public image positive and on brand. We can't place the onus of protecting the community and the community's brand on these victims of sexual assault and gender-based violence. It's not fair, and it's not fair to shame them when they don't carry that undue burden. So in a timely example, if we look at Bandi Chor Divas and we look at Guru Hargobind's example, when he was finally freed by Jahangir, upon his release, he refused to leave until the 52 Hill Rajas were also released. And Jahangir's only condition was that whoever could hold on to the Guru's robes could be released. So we know the story of his chola being big enough and long enough for all of the prisoners to be freed. And this might seem like a stretch, but I think the overarching message here is that Guru Hargobind oriented himself around getting justice not just for himself, but for the prisoners who were not freed. And he couldn't embrace his own fortune at the expense of other prisoners. So our history teaches us to not just be thinking about ourselves and thinking about what benefits us as individuals. Because if we think about our branding and orienting ourselves around our branding, that's not about the community's best interest. Because the community's best interest should be, what should be in the community's best interest is protecting the people within the community who are suffering. And so orienting ourselves around expecting better of our community and fighting for the freedom of all members of our community is really, really important. And I think Guru Hargobind is a good example of that.
So I know we've thrown a lot at you all. The question we move to next is, where do we go from here? So within each of those, we were trying to provide recommendations, examples from Gurbani and history of why our Sikh context teaches us to listen to survivors, believe survivors, create spaces for that. So we have a couple of recommendations that we've thought about, and we'd love to hear yours as well. So where do we go from here? We need to have conversations about sexuality, gender norms, masculinity, privilege, power dynamics, consent, healthy intimacy, starting at a young age. It's important that children are able to name their body parts and know what harm could look like in child appropriate ways. And so I love this book here. It's Not the Stork. In so many ways, we have euphemisms and myths about even where babies come from. And so I like this book because it talks through a lot of this language in a very child appropriate, friendly way. And it makes it accessible and in a child friendly way. So next, we need to shut up and speak up. So sorry for the harsh language, but I think sometimes that awakening is really important. So we can make sure to disrupt conversations that objectify women and girls and actively dismantle the ideals of Punjabi masculinity in our day-to-day lives. So we need to understand that pyramid again, that our ideals are informed by patriarchal stereotypes that not only endanger the most vulnerable parts of our community, but really harm all of us together collectively. Men especially can engage actively in these conversations, sharing about how they too are harmed by toxic masculinity. And we can use Guru Nanak Sahib's example to actively engage as allies to women by speaking up in situations where they feel that toxicity of masculinity and rape culture are being perpetuated. We can have conversations about consent versus coercion, about boundaries that we can set up for ourselves when it comes to relationships, and about how we can make those boundaries clear to our partners. And how to speak up. Speaking up is the hardest part when we feel like maybe our boundaries have been crossed, but we don't want to upset the person that we're in that relationship with. We also have to learn about boundaries in order to make sure that we ourselves are not the ones crossing other people's boundaries or causing harm. We can talk with our family members about these issues and actively work towards moving them away from the things that we never talk about to the things that we should make sure to talk about. And we can believe women and men, boys and girls, when they do tell us that they've experienced something, when they share their stories with us. Where do we go from here? We can expand and maintain networks of safety. Ideally, we could have that tipping point in the same way that we've seen in Hollywood and in certain academic spaces. We could see men and women coming forward on Twitter with their hashtags, and our community responding with open arms and thinking appropriately of how to think about consequences. That would be the ideal. Given all of the things that we've talked about, the reality of this situation is not likely to happen anytime soon. So until that, we still need to figure out a way to keep the members of our community safe. Women in particular have been doing a lot of this work, and I think we can all point to like a person that we've seen who we've kind of had questions about, like they were creepy, something about them felt off. We need to continue sharing that. I've had some of those conversations and opened up to other people about it, and turns out they had similar thoughts and they had stories behind those thoughts. So, having those networks of safety is very, very important, having those dialogues and expanding them. We don't know who has that knowledge about that person. And so having some of that dialogue is very, very important until the time when we can move this conversation to a public domain. Finally, where do we go from here? We need to believe people's experiences. So statistically, rape, sexual assault, domestic violence has been studied for a number of decades, and what they found is that only 2 to 8% of people actually lie. But so that means that 92 to 98% of people are telling the truth. If they come forward to you, the likelihood is that they're telling the truth. It's not, they're not trying to malign the community. They're not idle and bored. There's no benefit to them for coming forward. So we need to learn to believe people's experiences. And I think part of that is like having the language to know what is healthy, what's unhealthy, and what's abusive. We have to do some of that digging ourselves. So I really, really like this graphic here that kind of dives deeper into what is healthy, what's unhealthy and abusive. And I encourage everyone here, if they've never had that conversation with themselves, let alone other people, to look up this graphic or even type in healthy, unhealthy, abusive into Google and continue doing some of that self-education so that when someone does come to you, you can be like, okay, that sounds very familiar to something that to what I saw about what's very unhealthy or what's abusive.
And I'll also add, like, even the learning to believe people's experiences part is hard sometimes, because I mean, we talked about this before, but sometimes the person that you hear about is a respected member of the community, someone that you respect, and someone that might have been really important to you at some point in your life. And we've found ourselves even having that conversation of like finding out about a particular person and then even like catching ourselves making excuses for them. And so the question sometimes goes to like, well, what if they never did it again? Or what if they're sorry? Or what if she's not telling the truth? And usually it doesn't come to that last one, but even the sort of like knee-jerk reaction that we have like experienced in our own conversations of making excuses for perpetrators is something to just like take a step back from and ask yourself, like, why am I doing that? And I think a lot of times it comes down to not wanting to believe that someone could do the things that you've heard about them doing. And I understand that. But I think, so I think what I'm trying to say is learning to believe people's experiences, like, it's an active thing. It's not just something where you hear it and you're like, okay, I hear you. You have to like really listen and internalize what you're hearing and actively sort of fight whatever knee-jerk reactions you might be having. Okay, so we actually did very well on time, but that's good because that means that we can open this up to discussion and questions. So
thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is some of the social media for SikhRI that I've listed here. And then we're also going to, during the conversation, put up the resources slide again. But yeah, if you guys want to start sending your questions to us, we can start opening up a dialogue, which would be, I think, be very beneficial.
So Jasleen and Gurleen, I already see something in the questions panel if you want to address that.
I don't think we can see it, actually.
Okay, let me see what I can do to.
Okay, thanks.
Can you again check if you can see it? The question panel?
Yes.
Okay.
So to answer Diljit's question.
Well, can you say it again?
So the question is, as this involves many challenges, have there been any grassroots efforts in the diaspora to affect any change in a small way? Yes, there have been. So I'll speak of 2 or 3 examples. I'll start with the Jakara Movement. The Jakara Movement hosted their conference. It's a California-based grassroots organization, and they do a conference for college students and now high school students, for those of you who aren't familiar with them. And one of their topics is Kaur Voices, in which we dive deeper into these issues over like a 4-day conference. And from that's where the Kaur Voices Poetry Night has stemmed from, that multiple college campuses now host to give space to men and women to talk about their experiences. In addition to that, as you see here listed, the Sikh Family Center does that direct service work. So direct service meaning people have already been affected, let's support them. They do that sort of work. They also do the prevention work. So the education side, they've been going into high schools and colleges, talking to the youth about healthy relationships. And even SikhRI, I'll let Jasleen step in, has done some cool work with youth as well.
Oh, I was like, what is she talking about? Yeah, so part of what was mentioned in my bio is that SikhRI has launched this Naujawan Soji program that's for Sikh teenagers, and part of the curriculum for that is talking about sexuality. It's talking about relationships. We talk about consent, and sort of addressing a lot of the problems that come up, not problems, but the questions that come up when you're, a teenager and you're starting to sort of explore your own relationships and your own sexuality. That's one thing that we've been doing. I know Harinder Singh has done a webinar on sexuality, a live webinar on sexuality that is on YouTube if you're interested. But yeah, I think some of that work is being done, but I think the community also has to take a few steps towards the center, and sort of meet these organizations in the middle if we want to see like lasting, expansive change. Yeah.
So the next question asks, I've seen the hypocrisy of not allowing women to do seva at their bar sahib. Are there any thoughts of starting a hashtag or a diaspora movement to pressure those in charge to allow those women to do the seva? I think that's a great question. I have my thoughts, and maybe Jasleen can step in as well. So I think hashtags can be great, to validate a lot of the experiences other people have had. Posting on Facebook, things like that can all be really wonderful. I think they can also be very limiting. What's that term people say? Hashtag activism or social media activists. A lot of millennials in particular engage in this sort of way, but that doesn't necessarily translate into changing the lived realities of people, or changing the practices that are full of hypocrisy, like you're mentioning. So I think if like there's an example of, we see a discrepancy happening in front of our eyes, like in our gurdwaras, like the better thing, or like maybe the more impactful thing, or equally impactful thing, would be to do something in that moment. Do something in that moment to address it, to call that person out, or like to create spaces where maybe women feel more comfortable coming forward. Each situation is contextually different, but I think working within our context is equally important as like doing something online.
Yeah, so if I can add to that, thank you again, Diljit, for that other question. I think this is important. But funny enough, in Naujawan Soji, we did a session on women in Sikhi, and my class was mostly like teen girls and a couple of boys, and I think all of them, all the girls had stories about being told that they couldn't sit behind the Guru Granth Sahib, being told that they couldn't do something like seva related in the Gurdwara because they are girls, or because yeah, usually because they're girls. And I think the difference is that's something that we see happening in front of us all the time. So it's like with like a Me Too movement, it's like you're spreading awareness about how common the issue is. And there's like a danger with this particular issue of just like social media activism, and I agree with Gurleen on that. But I think something that was said in that particular class was by one of the boys was, well, if the girls don't want to listen to people telling them not to participate in something, if they have a problem with it, they should speak up. And I think that's a pretty common, I mean, we saw it even in the comments on the Me Too, like on this webinar post on SikhRI's Facebook, is like people saying, well, if it's happening to them, they should say something about it. And I think what Gurleen said is really important, that if we're going to talk about changing a system, we need to have the people who have more upward mobility within that system. So like men and boys who are just generally more respected a lot of the times by, especially by the people telling women they can't do certain things. Like men and boys, when they see that happening, say something. Because a lot of times if it's happening to you as a woman, like it's hard in that moment to, one, like even understand what's going on because you're like shocked. Or two, like it's hard to even feel like you can say anything because that person clearly doesn't think that you have enough like weight in the community. Like they already clearly don't respect you if they're telling you that you're not allowed to participate. So why would they listen to you if you said, no, I'm going to sit behind the Guru Granth Sahib? So having allies in those particular moments is really important. But then there's also the balancing act of like, well, you don't want to disrupt like the Sangat and like everyone's experience in the Gurdwara that day. So it might be something that like if you see happen, you talk to the person afterwards and say, hey, that's not okay. Like what is, like why do you think that women can't participate in this particular thing? So yeah, I don't know. Like Gurleen said, it's like very tricky and very contextual. But I think that's a great question, and it's something that we think about all the time, to be honest. Anyone else?
And I guess I'll add once more that this issue of representation within our community, there are studies that have shown that like having spaces with more women, more diversity allows for it to be allows for there to be less violence. So it is a violence-free and preventative measure to take action in these sorts of ways. It goes back to the pyramid. It's all part of the same system. So for those who might like feel like this doesn't have something to do with violence, like it is still all very connected.
All right, so it looks like that's all the questions we have for now. I think Gurleen, should we call it a day?
I see another question come in. I'm not sure if you addressed it or not.
Wow, we just need to scroll. Okay. So the question is, how do women get men engaged in these issues or to stand up for women? And how can women entrust men to speak up and do the legwork?
Yeah,
sorry, legwork.
And that's from Jasleen Kaur from Maryland. Gurleen, you want to take a stab at it?
Oh, that's such a good question. I have a lot of thoughts. So I'll start with this. And I keep going back to the research because that's what I've had to read a lot of in the last couple of weeks. So what we know is when we're working with, there's a lot of people who've come to this conclusion as well, that we need to work with boys and men. They're the where the efforts need to be, not with just focusing on empowerment of women or whatever else. So a lot of people have tried to go into communities, to groups of men, and to have certain dialogues. Some of that has been like had the complete opposite effect of causing those men to continue acting in violent and more violent ways. And that's in part because of the way that we frame those dialogues. So we frame them as like, you're doing something wrong, you need to help, you need to get it together. As with men, as with all human beings, that sparks a sort of defensiveness within us. We're like, what are you talking about? You don't know nothing. You don't know anything. So what we're seeing now, especially at the college level, is trying to work with boys and men, asking them what their values are, kind of like the same way we did within this presentation. What are our values as a community? Drawing on that and working with men and boys as equal partners, as thought partners in the movement, as opposed to y'all mess this whole thing up, fix it. And that's what I've seen that's really worked. And in framing the dialogue in that way, I've seen men open up and become more vulnerable and say like, actually I really wanted to be a part of this, and I wanted to support, and I want to be a feminist, but like, I don't know, I feel like I'm about to get attacked. So taking that element out of it, I think is key. Yeah. Do you want to add to
that? Sure. Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I think, yeah, even when we were making this presentation, we were looking at like, what are the terms that we're using? And Gurleen is great at this, at telling me that one of the terms I'm using can be alienating. And so you don't, the like crux of it is that this isn't just a women's issue, right? Women aren't the only ones being abused. We know that for sure. And also, if the like one of our core values is not just the freedom and equality of ourselves and the sovereignty of ourselves, but freeing up everyone and the freedom and equality of all people within and without and outside of the community, then it's not ever an issue that has been just a women's issue. I think the idea that it just comes from the fact that like women have spearheaded a lot more of the response work, I guess. But also, I think another thing to think about is what we said before, like having these conversations with kids, and obviously in a way that's like kid friendly. But I mean, I know that I've had conversations with 13, 14-year-old girls who are already having situations and experiences where they're having to think about consent, and they're having to think about coercion, and they're having to think about harassment. And if we're not having conversations with girls and boys about what is okay, what is healthy, what is not healthy, what consent is, how do you like engage with the opposite sex, then I think it sets us up for having to do a lot of that legwork later in life, which is harder, because those sort of ideas are already ingrained in us. Yeah, great question. Do you want to read this one?
So there's a follow-up question from Gersharin. Do you have ideas on how existing organizations such as Gurdwaras can advance the cause? I think this. Do you want to answer? You're not ready.
I
Okay.
need to think.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Apologies. So it works in two different ways. There's prevention and there's response, and I think our Gurdwaras can do both. So what I know through working with the Sikh Family Center is that people will approach committee members or Baisabs, hey, I'm experiencing domestic violence, help me. Whatever else. The way they respond in that moment is so crucial. If they're not trained to just like listen and believe, and if they're trained, as through our normalization to to minimize and say, go back, it's going to be fine, like you're fine, like you're making this up. Like that's an issue. That's something that we can work on, training and working with our individual gurdwaras to make sure the people that are in positions of authority or that are the face of our community, that they know how to handle similar situations. That's essential. Then there's, I think, kind of like what the level of what Daljit was saying, of like making sure that women are represented, like within the Gurdwara space. So I think about like now, every time I go to Gurdwara, I always like see who's doing Chor Seva, and it's usually a man, and I always want to go up there, and I still don't feel comfortable going up there and like taking on that role. So I wonder, like, how can we create that comfortability earlier on, to get young girls to feel like they have a right to that space, to do that, or to do ardas or whatever other roles. I know we do that a lot in camp spaces, but we don't necessarily, it doesn't always translate into, Gurdwara spaces where there's a lot more power and whatever else dynamics. So those are two ideas, and
That's great.
we can have more.
Maybe, I don't know. I think because I don't have a background in this, I don't have as great of an answer, but I also think like counseling, I think, is part of response. And I think a lot of times, because of the way that, I mean, we've seen like some even, I don't even know why I'm saying even Gurdwara communities. A lot of Gurdwara communities are very gossipy and very like tight knit. So there has to be some sort of like trust that is built, and I don't know how that will look. But I think it's another reason behind why a lot of people don't even come to the Gurdwara space, with that particular problem or with that particular experience, because they're worried about it getting out to the entire community. So yeah, I don't know.
A follow-up question from Gersharan. Shouldn't our Granthis Ragis make this a topic of their kathas? Shouldn't this be part of the dialogue they engage in to advance our community? Fascinating question.
Yeah.
I think that's a lot. I don't know. I feel like my answer is going to be bad on this one. My knee-jerk reaction was to say, I've heard so many Granthis and like Baisabs get up in front of like the Sangat and say, to start their talk, calling out the aunties on like talking, and so like there's always this like attacking that's going on, which makes it hard for me to say the Granthis can be like the leaders in this movement.
Yeah,
That's my feeling.
Yeah, okay, great question. I think this is hard because honestly, it depends on the Granthi, and it depends on how they word it, and it depends on how they approach the particular topic. Because, again, if you have somebody sitting on a stage, and their wording is, "This is men's fault, and men have to do better," you can alienate the Sangat, and you can alienate them from participating in the movement in a way that like feels comfortable for them. So I don't know, because I think, I mean, a lot of times we talk about how a lot of our Granthis aren't even trained in like a lot of things. So I think maybe the idea that that like prevention and response idea that Gurleen had earlier, maybe that looks like also offering some sort of training for those like kind of fixtures of the community to be like sort of people that others come to with those problems, and that who can also like talk about those issues in a way that is that's not alienating, and that's like I don't know, like a gentle sort of approach to the topic, because it is so delicate. Ideally, ideally it would be part of the dialogue outside of the Gurdwara and inside of the Gurdwara. Like ideally that's where we would go. But I think it's so contextual based on like the person who happens to be the Granthi or the Ragi at a Gurdwara. Because as we know, there's been times where like even the perpetrators of assault are the Granthis or the Ragis at the Gurdwara. So it's a tricky question, but I think something to think about. It's definitely important. Yeah. All right. I guess there's no more questions. If
For
anybody...
real, we scrolled this
we
time.
scrolled this time. Oh. But maybe something to add before we sign off to the last thought is that if that is an ideal that we have for our Granthis, then as a community and through Gurdwara leadership, we can move to make that happen, with that being like criteria for the Granthis. I think that's a great idea.
Can I add something?
Yeah.
I think while the Gurdwara space is like important to tackle and to reform, in day-to-day, like I bring it back to day-to-day experiences and day-to-day lives when like people open up to us, are we ready like in those moments to receive certain knowledge? Are we creating spaces for that knowledge to even be shared? I think like I've made a lot of mistakes in terms of like when people have like opened up to me about certain experiences and then I questioned it. And I think we all have to, I'd like to focus also on like that personal, like making sure we're ready to receive that and hear people and validate people as well.
Yeah, actually, okay, so one more thing to add before we sign up. If we look at the examples of the gurus, they didn't focus on changing the system first. Like, yes, they said words about the problems with the system, but they focused on individuals and changing the individual values and building up a community of people who had the values that would propel us forward into progression, right? So yes, we can look to the possibility of having respected members of our community and leaders within the community continuing to propel this dialogue. But also, I think if we want lasting, expansive change, like as I've said before, it comes from like changing each of us as individuals and really like going back to the values that we know that we have, that I think there tends to be a disconnect when we talk about this particular issue. So yeah, I think we can leave it at that.
Thank you for everyone who attended.
Yeah.
If you have questions, you can email the SikhRI.
Yeah, email info@sikhri.org if you have any follow-up questions, and we'll get back to you.
Or so sorry to interrupt. Or they can post it on our social media, and we can follow up on that. Right?
Yep, sounds good.
Thank you, Jasleen and Gurleen. It was really, really very good presentation and a great discussion. You know, we needed that, right, to start within our community.
Thank you.
Yep. And thank you everyone for your questions. Please be reminded that these webinars are provided for free, but there is a cost associated with it, technology and administration. If you feel you have benefited from the particular webinar or others in the past, please consider making a donation to SikhRI or becoming a webinar sponsor. More details can be obtained in a follow-up email that you will receive by SikhRI. And a reminder, please wait a few seconds for the link to appear for a follow-up survey. Your feedback is extremely important to Sikh Research Institute, and we appreciate your time. Jasleen and Gurleen, do you have any closing comments? In case you do, I know you have discussed in like details, but if you do, please go ahead.
I would just say that like everyone can do something. Like it's a topic I feel very hopeful about. There's a lot of resources out there. Even if you don't want to look at any resources, there's always self-reflection. So it's not hopeless by any means. I think there's a lot of progress that's happening, and I'm excited to see what happens as we continue.
Couldn't have said it better.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. As I end the webinar, on behalf of SikhRI I thank our e-Sangat today. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.